I never thought I'd be sitting here telling this story. Hell, I never thought I'd live to see my 25th birthday. Yet here I am, decades later, carrying memories that don't quite fit into the ordinary world. Memories of what happened when I died on that beach in Normandy. Let me start by saying I was nobody special. Just a farm boy from Nebraska. Raymond Collins, 22 years old when Uncle Sam came calling. My parents had a wheat farm outside Hastings. Simple folk. Good folk. Dad fought in the Great War, came back with a limp and nightmares he never talked about. Mom kept us fed through the Depression somehow, stretching meals like it was some kind of miracle. I had two younger sisters, Mary and Beth, who looked at me like I hung the moon. Before the war, my biggest concern was whether we'd get enough rain for the crops or if Sarah Johnson from down the road would finally notice me at the county fair. Funny how small your problems seem in retrospect. I was fixing a tractor when I heard about Pearl Harbor. Dad came out, his face pale, and just said, "The Japs bombed our boys." We listened to Roosevelt on the radio that night, and I knew, we all knew, everything was about to change. I enlisted in January of '42. Didn't wait to be drafted. Something in me felt called to it, like it was my time to step up, just as my father had in his day. Mom cried, of course, but there was pride there too. Dad just shook my hand, his grip firm, and said, "Remember who you are out there." I didn't fully understand what he meant until much later. Basic training was at Fort Campbell. I'd worked hard all my life, but nothing prepared me for the grueling physical demands or the constant shouting of the drill sergeants. "Move your ass, Collins. My grandma could climb that wall faster than you." Sergeant Pearson seemed to take particular pleasure in making me do push-ups until my arms felt like rubber. But something strange happened over those weeks. All of us, boys from farms and cities, north and south, rich and poor, we became something else. A unit, a brotherhood. There was Danny Rossi from Brooklyn who talked so fast I could barely understand him. Thomas Washington, a Negro boy from Chicago with hands quick enough to catch flies midair, and James Freckles. O'Malley, a redhead from Boston who could make anyone laugh, even after a 20-mile march with full packs. We complained constantly but secretly grew proud of what our bodies could do, how we were transforming from civilians into soldiers. The Army wasn't just training our bodies, it was rewiring our minds, teaching us to think as one, to put the unit above ourselves. The only easy day was yesterday, Sergeant Pearson would say, and we'd repeat it like a mantra during particularly brutal training exercises. I wrote home every week. Simple letters about the weather, the food, the training, never about the fear that was starting to build as we realized where we were headed. I'd seen the newsreels about the war in Europe, the Nazi war machines steamrolling across countries. Sometimes at night, I'd lie awake wondering if I had what it took, if I could actually kill another man when the moment came. After basic, we were assigned to the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one. The Fighting First, they called us. There was a certain swagger expected when you wore that patch. Veterans from North Africa were already there, men with hollow eyes who didn't speak much about what they'd seen. They called us fresh meat and rarely bothered learning our names at first. We shipped out to England in early '44. The crossing was miserable, packed like sardines on a transport ship in rough seas. Half the men were seasick the entire time. I remember standing at the rail one night, watching the dark waves and realizing there were U-boats out there somewhere, hunting us. The vastness of the ocean made me feel small in a way that even the Nebraska sky never had. England was a flurry of more training, endless drills, amphibious landing exercises until we could do them in our sleep, equipment checks and weapons familiarization. We weren't told exactly where we'd be landing, but rumors flew. Everyone knew something big was coming. In those final weeks, a strange calm settled over me. I wrote more letters home, trying to find the right words in case they were my last. I sent extra to Sarah Johnson too, finally finding the courage to tell her how I felt. Funny thing about facing death, it makes you braver about some things. There was a church service the Sunday before we shipped out. The chaplain spoke about sacrifice and duty. I remember looking around at all those faces, some praying fervently, others staring blankly ahead, each man confronting his mortality in his own way. Freckles passed me a flask during the sermon, and we took a quick swig when no one was looking. The whiskey burned going down, but I welcomed it. "See you on the beach, farm boy," he whispered with that crooked grin of his. "Save some krauts for me, city boy," I whispered back. The night before the invasion, I couldn't sleep. None of us could. We played cards, wrote letters, checked our gear for the 100th time. Some men got roaring drunk. Others prayed. I did a bit of both. Sergeant Miller gathered our platoon together. He was a combat veteran from Sicily, a hard man but fair. "Tomorrow you'll find out what you're made of," he told us. "Some of you are going to freeze up. Some of you are going to do things you never thought you were capable of. But remember your training. Remember the man next to you is counting on you. You don't fight for some general or for FDR or even for the flag. You fight for the guy on your left and your right." I lay in my bunk that night, listening to the rain pattering against the barracks roof, mentally going through my equipment again and again. Rifle, ammunition, grenades, first aid kit, rations. Then I'd start over. Rifle, ammunition, grenades. We were woken at 200 hours on June 6th. The weather was awful, windy, rainy. There had already been delays, and rumors spread that Eisenhower was considering postponing again. But the orders came. We were going. The meal they gave us was supposed to be hearty: eggs, bacon, toast. But few could eat much. I forced myself to take a few bites, knowing I'd need the energy. The coffee I drank black and scalding hot, grateful for its bitter comfort. We geared up in silence, each man trapped in his own thoughts. I remember the weight, the crushing physical weight of everything we carried. The pack, the weapon, the ammunition. But there was another weight too, the invisible one pressing down on our chests, making it hard to breathe. The knowledge of what was coming? The trip to the embarkation point is mostly a blur. Transport trucks moving through darkened roads. The smell of wet canvas and cigarette smoke. Muffled conversations that always seemed to die out. Then we were at the harbor, looking at the vast armada assembled there. Ships of every size stretched as far as I could see. The scale of it was overwhelming. This was truly going to be the blow that would break Hitler's Atlantic Wall. We loaded onto our landing craft, Higgins boats they called them, flat-bottom vessels designed to run right up onto the beach. About 30 men packed in, equipment digging into our sides as we pressed together. I ended up near the front, which meant I'd be among the first out when the ramp dropped. Lucky me. The channel was rough. The little boat bucked and heaved in the waves, sending sprays of cold water over us. Many men got seasick, but there was nowhere to go, nothing to do but stand in it. The stench of vomit mixed with diesel fumes made my eyes water. I focused on breathing through my mouth. The trip from the transport ships to the beach was supposed to take about an hour. It felt like days. Time stretched and warped. I prayed, mouthing the words silently. My mother's rosary beads clutched in my fist. I wasn't particularly religious before the war, but there's something about facing death that makes you reach for faith. About halfway to the beach, Sergeant Miller tried to brief us again on what to expect, but his words were mostly swallowed by the noise of the engines and the sea. I caught phrases: get off the beach, find cover, rally points, the basics we drilled countless times. Freckles was across from me, his face a ghostly green from seasickness, but he still managed a wink when he caught my eye. Washington was checking his rifle for the 10th time. Rossi was murmuring what sounded like Italian prayers, each man facing what might be his last hour in his own way. As we got closer, we could hear it. The rumble of artillery, the distant crackle of small arms fire. The sky was starting to lighten, a grayish dawn breaking over what would become a day of infamy. The naval bombardment had begun, massive shells arcing overhead toward the German positions. 5 minutes, the coxswain shouted. 5 minutes. 5 minutes to steel myself. 5 minutes of being Raymond Collins, farm boy from Nebraska. 5 minutes before whatever came next. When that ramp drops, Miller barked, "You move! Don't stop on the beach. Head for the seawall. Find cover and keep moving." I checked my rifle one last time. An M1 Garand, 8 rounds in the clip. I had 5 extra clips plus my sidearm. I adjusted my helmet, tucked my chin into my chest, and whispered a final prayer. Then came the worst sound I'd ever heard. The metallic ping of bullets hitting the front of our landing craft. The Germans had spotted us. We were still in the water, completely exposed, and they were already firing. "Heads down," Miller shouted, but it was unnecessary. We were pressed as low as our pack conditions allowed. The boat lurched violently as a shell exploded nearby, sending a spray of water over us. Someone screamed. The craft continued its relentless push toward the shore. Then came the grinding sensation as we hit the sandbar. The boat stopped, rocking in the waves. 30 yards out, the coxswain yelled. Dropping ramp. The front ramp began to lower, and that's when time slowed to a crawl. I could see everything with crystal clarity. The gray-green water churning with foam, the beach ahead littered with obstacles and bodies, the mist of gunfire tracers cutting through the air. As the ramp splashed into the water, a machine gun opened up directly on our boat. The men in front disappeared in a spray of red. There was no time to think, no time to be horrified. Go! 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 Miller was screaming. I plunged forward into chest-deep water that hit me like an icy slap. The weight of my gear immediately tried to drag me down. Men were dying all around me, some drowning before they even faced enemy fire, pulled under by their heavy packs. Others were cut down by the relentless German machine guns positioned in the concrete bunkers above the beach. Somehow I kept moving, half swimming, half walking through the water, my rifle held above my head, the taste of salt and fear in my mouth. Bullets slapped the water around me, creating tiny geysers. It seemed impossible that anyone could make it through this wall of lead. Yet somehow I was still alive, still moving. My boots finally hit sand, and I immediately dropped to my belly, crawling, using the bodies of the fallen as shields. God forgive me. The roar was deafening. Gunfire, explosions, the screams of the wounded and dying, officers shouting orders that no one could hear. I spotted Freckles a few yards ahead, motioning frantically toward a disabled tank that offered some cover. I crawled toward it, my elbows and knees grinding into the wet sand mixed with blood. Made it to the tank and pressed my back against its cold metal, gasping for breath. When we gotta move up. Freckles shouted, his face streaked with sand and sweat. Can't stay here. He was right. We were still in the killing zone, too exposed. I nodded, scanning for the next bit of cover. A cluster of Czech hedgehogs about 20 yards ahead. These were the beach obstacles meant to tear open landing craft at high tide, but now they offered precious cover. On 3, I shouted. 1. 2. 3. 3. We ran, crouched low, zigzagging as bullets kicked up sand around our feet. I heard Freckles grunt beside me but kept moving. Made it to the hedgehogs and collapsed behind them, turning to see my friend clutching his arm, blood seeping between his fingers. Just a graze, he said through gritted teeth, but his face had gone pale. I helped him bind it quickly with a first aid pack. All around us, similar scenes were playing out. Men finding whatever cover they could, treating wounds, gathering strength for the next push. Collins. O'Malley. It was Washington, somehow still alive, calling from a shell crater a few yards away. Rally here. We made our break for it, diving into the crater where we found Washington and 3 other men from our platoon. No sign of Miller or Rossi. The crater offered better protection, but we couldn't stay long. The beach was a death trap. The only way out was forward. Anyone see the lieutenant? Washington asked. Head shakes all around. Officers had been prime targets for German snipers as soon as we hit the beach. All right, Washington said, taking charge naturally. We move up to the seawall in groups of 2. Cover fire for each pair. I ended up paired with a replacement whose name I didn't even know. A baby-faced kid who looked like he should be at a high school dance. Not in this hell. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his rifle. Stay on my left, I told him. Run when I run, stop when I stop. We'll make it. He nodded mutely. Washington and another man went first, with the rest of us laying down, covering fire toward the German positions. They made it to a tangle of barbed wire about halfway to the seawall. Then it was our turn. Ready? I asked the kid. Yes, he stammered. Go! We burst from the crater, running in a crouch. The air seemed alive with buzzing metal. The sand erupted in tiny explosions around our feet. 20 yards to Washington's position. 15. 10. The impact when it came felt like being kicked by a mule. A hot punch to my left side that spun me halfway around. I stumbled but kept moving, adrenaline masking the pain. Made it to the barbed wire and dropped down beside Washington. You're hit, he said, his eyes wide. I looked down to see a spreading dark stain on my jacket. I'm okay, I gasped, though I wasn't sure if that was true. The pain was building now, a burning that made it hard to think. The kid had made it too, wide-eyed but unscathed. No time to dwell on my wound. The seawall was still ahead, and beyond it, the German pillboxes needed to be taken out. More men were making it off the beach now, gathering in small groups wherever they could find cover. Someone had managed to get a Bangalore torpedo up to clear a path through the wire. The explosion sent dirt and metal fragments flying, but it opened a gap. Let's go! Through the wire, someone shouted. I pushed myself up, ignoring the stabbing pain in my side. The kid helped me, his arm around my waist as we stumbled through the gap in the wire. Freckles was on my other side, his wounded arm hanging limp but still moving forward. We made it to the base of the seawall, a concrete barrier that offered the first real protection from the direct fire of the German positions. Dozens of men were gathered there, medics working frantically on the wounded, officers trying to reorganize the scattered units. A medic spotted my blood-stained jacket and moved toward me, but I waved him off. Others need it more, I said, though in truth, I was starting to feel lightheaded. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the reality of my wound was setting in. A captain I didn't recognize was gathering men for an assault on a pillbox that was raking the beach with murderous fire. "We need to take it out, or the next waves are going to get slaughtered just like we did," he explained. Despite my wound, I volunteered. So did Freckles in Washington. The captain quickly outlined the plan, covering fire from the seawall while a small group worked around the side with satchel charges. I was assigned to the covering fire team, probably because the captain could see I was wounded. As men readied themselves for the assault, I checked my weapon and took stock of my condition. The bleeding had slowed, but my side felt like it was on fire. Each breath sent a stab of pain through me. Still, I could shoot, and that's what mattered at that moment. The assault began with a barrage of covering fire from our position. Every rifle that could bear opened up on the pillbox firing slits, trying to keep the Germans' heads down while the assault team made their move. I fired methodically, 8 rounds, the empty clip ejecting with that distinctive ping, reload, continue firing. The pain receded as I focused on the rhythm of it. Beside me, the kid who'd helped me through the wire was firing too, his earlier terror replaced by grim determination. The assault team made it to the side of the pillbox. We saw the flash as they set off the charges. The explosion sent concrete chunks flying, and for a moment, the German gun fell silent. A cheer went up from our position, cut short as another machine gun from a different pillbox opened up. The beach behind us was still a killing field, with fresh waves of troops trying to make it to our position. "We need to take the next one," the captain shouted. But as I tried to rise, the world tilted alarmingly. The blood loss was catching up to me. I slumped back against the seawall, my rifle suddenly too heavy to hold. "Medic!" Freckles called, suddenly at my side again. "Man down!" A combat medic skidded next to me, already opening his kit. "Where you hit, soldier?" "Left side," I managed. The pain was intense now, radiating across my abdomen. He cut away my jacket and shirt, revealing a ragged hole just below my ribcage. "Exit wound?" he asked, trying to check my back. I shook my head. "Don't think so." His face grew serious. "The bullet's still in there. You need to get back to the aid station." But there was no clear path back. The beach was still under heavy fire, and the aid stations themselves were overwhelmed with casualties. I was stuck here, bleeding internally as the battle raged around me. "Give me morphine," I said. "I can still shoot." The medic hesitated, then jabbed the cigarette into my thigh. The blessed relief spread quickly, dulling the pain to a manageable throb. He packed the wound as best he could and moved on to the next casualty. For what seemed like hours, I drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes firing at German positions, sometimes just trying to stay conscious. All around me, the battle for the beach continued. Men died. Men performed incredible acts of bravery. The tide slowly turned as more troops made it ashore, as tanks finally provided support, as naval gunfire knocked out some of the larger German positions. I remember Freckles returning at one point, his face grim. "Washington didn't make it," he said simply, and I nodded, unable to process another loss. The kid whose name I never learned was gone too, carried away by a medic after taking shrapnel from a mortar. By mid-afternoon, we had secured enough of the beach to begin moving inland. The wounded were being evacuated more efficiently now. I was placed on a stretcher, the movement sending fresh waves of agony through me despite the morphine. As they carried me back across the beach toward an evacuation boat, I saw the full scale of what had happened. Bodies everywhere, some at the water's edge being taken by the tide, others sprawled where they had fallen. Equipment scattered and abandoned, the sand stained red in patches. And yet men were still landing, still moving forward, the invasion proceeding despite the terrible cost. I remember thinking, as they loaded me onto a boat, that I had done my part. I had made it off the beach. I would go home with a purple heart and stories I'd never be able to fully tell. I remember feeling grateful to be among the wounded rather than the dead. That's the last clear memory I have before things get different. The next part is harder to explain, harder to make people understand, because what happened next doesn't fit neatly into the world as most people understand it. The evacuation boat was crowded with wounded. Medics moved between us, checking bandages, administering morphine, applying tourniquets. I was placed near the bow, my stretcher secured to the deck somehow. The pain was worse now, a deep burning in my gut that told me something was very wrong inside. I felt cold despite the June sun. My vision would blur, then sharpen, then blur again. I heard someone say internal bleeding and might not make it to the hospital ship. I tried to speak, to tell them I wasn't ready to die, but no words came out. As we moved farther from shore, I could still see the beach, still hear the distant thunder of artillery. And then something strange happened. The sounds began to fade, not because we were moving away, but as if someone was slowly turning down the volume of the world. My vision tunneled, the edges going dark. I wasn't afraid, which was itself strange. I should have been terrified, but instead, I felt a peculiar detachment, as if I were observing myself from a distance. The pain began to recede too, replaced by a spreading numbness. I remember thinking, so this is what dying feels like, with a clinical interest that seemed completely divorced from the fact that it was happening to me. A medic appeared above me, his face tight with concern. His mouth was moving, but I couldn't hear him anymore. He was checking my pulse, shining a light in my eyes. I wanted to tell him it was okay, that I didn't hurt anymore, but I couldn't seem to make my body respond. Then came the moment that changed everything. The moment that divides my life into before and after. I felt a peculiar sensation, like a release of tension I hadn't even known I was carrying. And suddenly I was looking down at myself. I was still on the stretcher, my body pale and still. The medic was performing chest compressions, his movements urgent. Another medic had appeared with what must have been a field blood transfusion kit. But I was watching this from above, floating near the ceiling of the boat. My first thought, strangely enough, was, that can't be right. It was so contrary to everything I understood about reality that my mind simply rejected it at first. But there I was, looking down at my own body, feeling more alert and aware than I had in hours. I felt no connection to the body below. It seemed like an empty shell, something I had discarded. The Raymond Collins being worked on by desperate medics wasn't me anymore. I was here, above, watching with a curious detachment. I remember noticing details with incredible clarity. The worn leather of the medic's bag, the frayed edge of my own uniform sleeve, the beads of sweat on the forehead of the man trying to save me. I could see things I shouldn't have been able to see, like the contents of the medic's bag and the faces of men behind me, without turning. Then I realized I was moving, not floating higher, but somehow expanding outward. The boat grew smaller below me as my awareness spread. I could see the whole flotilla now, dozens of vessels moving between the shore and the larger ships waiting in deeper water. And I could see the beach, the entire stretch of what I would later learn was called Omaha. From this perspective, the battle looked almost choreographed, a terrible dance of destruction and courage. I could see where German positions were weakening, where our forces were breaking through, the ebb and flow of the confrontation that would help decide the fate of Europe. But more than that, I could sense something I can only describe as the collective consciousness of the men fighting and dying below. Their fear, their determination, their pain, and their hope, all of it washed over me in waves. I wasn't just seeing the battle, I was feeling it, experiencing thousands of individual moments simultaneously. It should have been overwhelming, but somehow my consciousness expanded to accommodate it all. I felt connected to every man on that beach, every soul engaged in that momentous struggle. I understood then that what was happening that day was bigger than any individual. It was humanity making a stand against darkness, paying a terrible price for freedom. And then something even stranger happened. The scene below began to fade, not to blackness, but to a soft, luminous light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sounds of battle, which had returned to my awareness, faded again, replaced by what I can only describe as a harmonic vibration. Not quite sound, but something felt rather than heard. I was moving again, or being drawn towards something. There was a sense of acceleration, of rushing forward while also expanding in all directions. The light grew brighter, but instead of being blinding, it was welcoming, revealing rather than concealing. And then I wasn't alone anymore. I perceived them before I saw them, presences that radiated a familiar love. As they became clearer, I recognized my grandfather, who had died when I was 10, and my childhood friend Elliot, who had drowned in the creek when we were both 14. They appeared not as I remembered them in life, but as their essential selves, pure consciousness clothed in recognizable form for my benefit. "Raymond," my grandfather said, though he didn't speak with words exactly. It was more like his thoughts touched mine directly. "You've arrived earlier than expected." I tried to respond and found I could communicate in the same way. "Am I dead?" For the moment, Elliot answered, his familiar mischievous energy still evident in his presence. But it's not quite decided yet. Other figures appeared behind them. People I somehow recognized despite never having met them in life. Ancestors. A great uncle who died in the previous war. A baby sister who hadn't survived birth and whom my parents had never mentioned. They welcomed me with such love that it would have brought me to my knees if I'd still had them. There was no judgment, no questioning, just pure acceptance and joy at our reunion. "There's someone else who wants to speak with you," my grandfather said, and the presences parted. What approach cannot be adequately described in human language. It wasn't a person or even a being in the way we understand such things. It was more like a focal point of the light itself, a concentration of conscious love so intense that even in that place I could barely comprehend it. Communication with this presence was different, deeper, more fundamental. It didn't convey thoughts, but rather direct understanding that bloomed within me. And what I understood was that I was being shown something few get to see while still having the chance to return. In the presence of this light, I experienced what I can only call a life review. But it wasn't just my life I was seeing. I witnessed the interconnected web of actions and consequences that linked my existence to countless others. I saw how small kindnesses I had forgotten had changed the course of someone else's day, which changed their actions, which affected others in turn. I saw how moments of selfishness or cruelty had done the same in the opposite direction. But there was no condemnation in this showing, only truth laid bare with perfect compassion. I understood that we are all connected in ways our earthly minds cannot grasp, that every action ripples outward in patterns too complex for human comprehension. The light communicated something else too, that the suffering I had witnessed on the beach was not meaningless, that the sacrifice of those men was part of a larger pattern working toward greater freedom and love in the world. Not that war itself was good or necessary, but that the courage and selflessness displayed within its terrible context was helping to slowly bend the arc of human history toward light. Then came a choice. I could stay in this place of perfect understanding and love, continuing a journey I somehow knew would be wondrous beyond imagination. Or I could return, back to the pain, back to the limited perspective, back to the heavy physical body and all its demands. Why would I go back? I asked, though I already sensed the answer forming within me. "Because there's more for you to do," my grandfather said. "Because your thread in the tapestry isn't complete. And because you'll bring something back with you," Elliot added. "A fragment of this understanding. A message." The light intensified around me, and I felt myself being shown more. Visions of a possible future, my role in it, the lives I would touch if I return. I saw my future children, people I would help, moments of beauty I would experience and create. But I also saw the pain that awaited, the recovery from my wounds, the nightmares that would haunt me, the struggle to readjust to a world that would seem flat and limited after what I had experienced. "The choice is yours," the light communicated, "and either choice is accepted with love." I hesitated. The peace and understanding of this place was so complete, so perfect, that returning seemed almost unthinkable. Yet I could feel a tug, a connection still linking me to that broken body on the boat. What decided me in the end was seeing Freckles in my vision of the future. His face older, lined with experience, sitting across from me on a porch somewhere as we shared memories no one else could understand. I saw Washington's younger brother, whom I would somehow meet and to whom I would convey a message that would bring peace. I saw my mother's face when I returned home alive. "I'll go back," I said. The light enveloped me completely then, and I felt what I can only describe as a blessing. A transmission of strength and love that would sustain me through what was to come. My grandfather and the others receded, their love still palpable but growing more distant. "Remember," Elliot called as he faded. "Remember what you've seen when the earthly veil tries to make you forget." Then came a rushing sensation, a rapid constriction, as if I were being squeezed back into a too small container. The light dimmed, the expansive awareness contracted, and suddenly, agonizingly, I was back in my body. The pain hit me like a physical blow. Every nerve ending screamed as my consciousness reintegrated with my wounded flesh. I gasped, choking on a tube that had been placed down my throat. Hands held me down as I thrashed, my body rebelling against its sudden re-imprisonment. "He's back!" someone shouted. "I've got a pulse." My eyes flew open to see the metal ceiling of what I later learned was the hospital ship's operating room. A surgeon loomed over me, his mask spattered with what I realized was my blood. "You're one lucky son of a bitch, soldier," he said, his eyes crinkling with what might have been a smile behind his mask. "We lost you for almost 4 minutes there." 4 minutes. It had felt like both an eternity and no time at all. They sedated me then, and I slipped into unconsciousness, ordinary unconsciousness, without visions or light or departed loved ones. Just darkness and occasional bubbles of half-formed dreams. When I next woke, I was in a recovery ward. The steady throb of the ship's engines vibrated through the metal frame of my bed. My side was heavily bandaged, and tubes ran into my arms. I felt hollowed out, wrung dry, but undeniably alive. A nurse noticed I was awake and came over, checking my vitals with brisk efficiency. "Where am I?" I managed to croak, my throat raw from the intubation. "Hospital ship USS Comfort," she said. "You're headed back to England. Surgery went well. They got the bullet and stopped the bleeding. You'll live, Lieutenant." "Lieutenant?" I wasn't a lieutenant, but before I could correct her, exhaustion dragged me back under. The next days were a blur of pain, medication, and brief periods of lucidity. I learned that I had indeed been promoted on the field after most of the officers in our company had been killed. I learned that we had taken the beach, though at a terrible cost. I learned that the invasion was proceeding, pushing inland toward the heart of Nazi-occupied France. What I couldn't learn was what had happened to Freckles, to Rossi, to the nameless kid who had helped me through the wire. The nurses didn't know, and the few other men from my unit in the hospital ward had been landed at different sections of the beach. But through the pain and disorientation, the memory of what I had experienced remained crystal clear. While other memories might blur around the edges with time and trauma, my death experience, because that's what it was, I had died, whatever the medical records might try to classify it as, remained perfectly preserved, more real in some ways than the hospital room around me. I tried once to tell a nurse about it. She smiled indulgently and checked my morphine dosage. I didn't speak of it again during my hospital stay, but I thought of it constantly. The sense of universal connection I had felt, the understanding of how profoundly our lives intertwine, the knowledge that there is something beyond the physical world we perceive, all of it remained with me, a secret truth I carried within. As I began to recover physically, able to sit up and eventually to walk short distances, I struggled with the limitations of being back in my body. The world seemed duller somehow, confined to what my five senses could detect. I missed the expansive awareness I had briefly experienced, but there were compensations. The taste of real food after weeks of hospital meals, the simple pleasure of sun on my face when they wheeled me out onto the deck for fresh air, the letters from home that finally caught up with me, including one from Sarah Johnson that made me blush, and the nurses teased me for days. And there was something else, a new clarity about my purpose. Not in any grandiose sense, but a quiet certainty about what mattered. The petty concerns that had once occupied me, status, possessions, appearances, seemed trivial now. What remained important was love, connection, truth, and service to others. By late July, I was well enough to be moved to a convalescent hospital in southern England. The pain had subsided to a manageable ache, and I could walk unaided, though not far. The doctors said I would recover fully in time, though the scar would remain. It was there, among men slowly mending from the wounds of war, that I first began to speak cautiously about my experience. Not to the doctors or nurses, who I feared would dismiss it as trauma or medication-induced hallucination, but to other soldiers who had brushed against death themselves. To my surprise, I wasn't alone. A tank commander who had been trapped in a burning Sherman, a paratrooper who had been clinically dead for 2 minutes after a drop behind enemy lines, a naval officer caught in a boiler explosion. Each had touched something beyond the physical world, though their experiences varied in detail. We formed an unofficial club of sorts, meeting in a quiet corner of the hospital gardens to share what we had seen, to affirm for each other that we weren't crazy, that what had happened to us was real. Through these conversations, I began to see patterns. While our experiences weren't identical, there were common elements. The sense of leaving one's body, the encounter with deceased loved ones, the light, the life review, the choice to return. Whatever lay beyond death, it seemed to follow certain contours. More importantly, none of us came back unchanged. Regardless of religious background or lack thereof, we had all returned with a similar message, that love is the fundamental reality, that we are all connected, that our actions matter more than we can possibly understand from our limited earthly perspective. As I grew stronger, I began to write, first in a journal provided by a Red Cross volunteer, then in long letters home. I tried to articulate what had happened, knowing the words were inadequate but feeling compelled to try anyway. I didn't mail most of these letters, sensing that my family wouldn't understand, at least not yet. But the act of writing helped me process the experience, to integrate it into my understanding of the world. By September 1944, the question of my future loomed. My wounds had healed enough that I would soon be evaluated for either return to duty or discharge. Part of me wanted to rejoin my unit, to see the war through alongside men like Freckles if he had survived. But another part knew that my war was over, that I had a different purpose now. The Army made the decision for me. My injuries were deemed serious enough to warrant a medical discharge. I would be sent home with a Purple Heart, a battlefield promotion that was confirmed despite the irregular circumstances, and the knowledge that I had done my duty. The night before I was to leave the hospital, a new patient was brought into my ward. He was heavily bandaged, fresh from the fighting around Antwerp, but something about him looked familiar. It wasn't until the nurse called him O'Malley that I realized. "Freckles?" I said, rising from my bed and approaching his. "James O'Malley?" His face, what was visible of it, registered shock, then joy. "Farm boy? Collins? Good God, they told me you bought it on the beach." We clasped hands, both of us fighting back tears. He looked terrible, thin, pale, with a network of healing cuts on his face that would leave their own scars. "But he was alive. Caught a mortar blast outside Carentan," he explained. "Not quite as pretty as I used to be, but the nurses say it adds character." We talked for hours, filling in the gaps of what had happened since D-Day. He told me who had made it and who hadn't. Washington had indeed died on the beach. Rossi had survived and was still with the unit, last Freckles had heard. Sergeant Miller had made it through D-Day, only to be killed 2 weeks later by a sniper. I told him I was heading home, and he congratulated me with genuine warmth. "One of us should get out of this mess in one piece," he said. "You'll have to drink enough beer for both of us back in the States." I promised I would. Then hesitantly, I asked if he had experienced anything unusual when he was wounded. He gave me a long look, then glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "Like whether I saw anything while they were putting me back together?" he asked quietly. When I nodded, he continued, "Nothing like that for me. Just lights out, then waking up in a field hospital with a chaplain looking disappointed that he wouldn't be saying last rites after all." I felt a familiar disappointment. Not everyone who came close to death had the experience I did, I had learned. But then Freckles surprised me. But my grandpa, when I was a kid, he fell through ice on a lake, was under for minutes before they got him out. No heartbeat, not breathing. They brought him back somehow, and afterward, he told me things about a tunnel and light and seeing his parents who had died years before. He paused, studying my face. "You saw something, didn't you?" "When they lost you on that boat." So I told him. Everything. The leaving of my body, the expanded awareness, my grandfather and Elliot, the light, the life review, the choice to return. I spoke without censoring myself, without the careful editing I had learned to apply when speaking to doctors or skeptical patients. And he listened without interruption, his expression shifting from curiosity to wonder. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "You know what this means, right?" "What?" "It means that poor Washington isn't just gone, and neither is Miller or any of the others. Friedrich. They're somewhere else, somewhere better." I nodded, throat tight with emotion. That's exactly what it means. We talked until dawn about death and life and what might come after, about the war and what we had seen and done, about the men we had lost and the future that awaited us if we survived. It was the kind of conversation that forms a bond deeper than most people ever experience. And I knew, just as I had seen in my vision, that he would remain in my life long after the war ended. The next morning, as I prepared to leave for the ship that would take me home, Freckles gave me a crumpled piece of paper. "Washington's brother," he said, "lives in Chicago. Address is there. If you meant what you said about telling their families." I folded the paper carefully and put it in my pocket next to my orders. "I'll find him," I promised. Freckles nodded. "See you stateside, farm boy. Try not to die again before I get there." "No promises," I said with a smile, "but I'll try." As the ambulance drove me away from the hospital toward Southampton, where the transport ship waited, I looked back at the building that had been my home for months. So much had changed since I had stood on that beach, young and terrified and unaware of what awaited me. I had died in return. I had glimpsed what lay beyond the veil of ordinary reality, and I was bringing that knowledge back with me. The English countryside rolled past, autumn painting the trees in golds and reds. In a few days, I would be on a ship crossing the Atlantic. In a couple of weeks, I would see the New York skyline, then board a train that would take me across the country to Nebraska, to my family's farm, to whatever came next. I touched the pocket where I had placed Washington's brother's address. I had promises to keep, messages to deliver. Not just to him, but to anyone who would listen. Because that was why I had come back, to speak the truth of what I had learned on the other side of death. That we are more than our bodies. That love transcends the physical world. That we are all connected in ways we can barely comprehend. And that even in the darkest moments of human history, even in the bloodiest battles on the most terrible days, there is meaning, there is purpose, and there is light waiting beyond the darkness. The journey home was long, but mercifully uneventful. I shared a crowded transport ship with hundreds of other wounded men, making the same pilgrimage back to American soil. Some were in high spirits, grateful to be leaving the war behind. Others were somber, haunted by what they'd seen or mourning what they'd lost. Limbs, friends, innocence. I fell somewhere in between. The pain in my side was a constant reminder of how close I'd come to not making it home at all. But there was something else too. A strange sense of peace that seemed to confound the doctors and nurses. Men with injuries like mine were expected to be traumatized, anxious, possibly depressed. Yet I felt a peculiar serenity that I struggled to explain to anyone who hadn't experienced what I had. "You're adjusting remarkably well, Lieutenant Collins," the ship's doctor commented during one of my checkups. "I died, sir," I replied simply. "Coming back from that gives you a different perspective." He chuckled, clearly thinking I was speaking metaphorically. "Well, whatever works. Just don't expect civilian life to be easy. It's a different kind of battle." I nodded, not bothering to correct his misunderstanding. I'd already learned that most people weren't ready to hear the truth of what I'd experienced. The few times I'd tried to explain it to medical personnel, I'd been met with patronizing smiles or concerned frowns and notes scribbled in my file. So I kept the most profound experience of my life largely to myself during that long Atlantic crossing. Instead, I spent hours at the railing when my strength permitted, watching the endless procession of waves and thinking about what awaited me. Would my family understand the changed man who was returning to them? Would Sarah Johnson still want the boy she'd written to now that he'd become something else entirely? And how would I fulfill the purpose I now felt so clearly, to share what I had learned beyond the veil of death? After 8 days at sea, we caught sight of the New York skyline emerging from the morning mist. The excitement on board was palpable as the ship edged into the harbor. Men crowded the rails, even those on stretchers brought up to see the Statue of Liberty holding her torch in welcome. Some cried unashamedly. Others cheered or prayed or simply stared in disbelieving silence. I felt a swell of emotion too, but it was complicated. America represented home, safety, the end of one journey. But I knew another journey was just beginning, one that might prove even more challenging in its own way. The processing at the military hospital in New York was a blur of paperwork, medical examinations, and debriefings. My wound was healing well, the doctors declared, though I would always carry the scar and might experience occasional pain. My military service was officially over. I was given my final pay, my discharge papers, and a train ticket to Nebraska. Before leaving New York, however, I had a promise to keep. I took a detour to Chicago, using some of my accumulated pay for the extra ticket. The address Freckles had given me for Washington's brother was in the South Side, in a predominantly Negro neighborhood. As I made my way there, I became acutely aware of the stares my uniform attracted. Some curious, some hostile, some respectful. The building was a rundown tenement, paint peeling from its facade, but the entrance was swept clean, and window boxes showing the last flowers of autumn suggested people who took pride in their homes despite the circumstances. I checked the paper again, apartment 3B, and made my way up the creaking stairs. Standing outside the door, I hesitated. What exactly was I going to say? "Hello, I watched your brother die?" The weight of my promise suddenly felt overwhelming. But before I could retreat, the door opened, and I found myself face to face with a man who looked so much like Thomas Washington that for a disorienting moment, I thought I was seeing a ghost. "Can I help you?" he asked, his expression guarded, as he took in my uniform and white face in this neighborhood. "Are you James Washington, Thomas's brother?" I managed. His face changed, grief and resignation washing over his features. "You've come about Tommy." It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. "I was with him at Normandy. My name is Raymond Collins." He studied me for a long moment, then stepped back. "You'd better come in." The apartment was small but immaculately kept. Photos adorned the walls, and I immediately spotted Thomas in several of them. younger, smiling in ways I'd rarely seen during our brief acquaintance in the army. A woman emerged from the kitchen, drying her hands on an apron, her questioning eyes moving from James to me. "This is Lieutenant Collins," James explained. "He served with Tommy." "Sarah Washington," she said, extending her hand. "James's wife." "Would you like some coffee, Lieutenant? You've come a long way." I accepted gratefully, and soon we were seated around a small table, steaming cups before us. James explained that they had received the official notification of Thomas's death weeks ago, but no details beyond "killed in action in the European theater." "I was hoping you might tell us." He trailed off, unable to finish. So I told him about Thomas as I had known him, his quickness, his courage, his steadying presence in our unit. I told them about D-Day, about how he had taken charge when officers fell, how he had saved lives, including mine, with his quick thinking. I didn't sanitize the horror of the beach, but I focused on Thomas's bravery, on how respected he had been. When I described his final moments, rushing forward to take out the German position that was decimating our forces, Sarah began to weep silently. James sat stone-faced, his grief controlled but visible in the tightness around his eyes. Then I took a deep breath and stepped into territory I knew might cost me their trust or respect. "There's something else I need to tell you," I said. "Something that happened to me after I was wounded. Something that involves Thomas." They looked at me with confusion, but something in my expression must have conveyed the importance of what I was about to share, because they waited in silence. "I died on the evacuation boat," I said simply. "Bullet was still inside me, internal bleeding." My heart stopped for several minutes. The medics brought me back, but during that time, I experienced something. I described my near-death experience as clearly as I could. The sensation of leaving my body, the expanded awareness, the light, the presences I had encountered. I watched their faces carefully, ready to stop if I saw disbelief or anger. But what I saw instead was intense attention. During my experience, I continued, I was shown that those who have passed on aren't just gone. They continue. They're somewhere else, somewhere beyond our physical world. And they're at peace. James leaned forward slightly. Did you see Tommy?" I shook my head. "Not directly. But I was given to understand that everyone who passes continues on this journey. And having experienced even a glimpse of that place, I can tell you there's no suffering there. Only understanding and love." Sarah wiped her eyes. "My grandmother used to talk about this. She was there when her mother passed, and she said she saw something leave the body, like a mist, she called it. Said she knew her mama wasn't really gone." James was silent for a long moment, then asked, "Why are you telling us this, Lieutenant? No offense, but white officers don't usually make special trips to colored neighborhoods to talk about the afterlife." It was a fair question. "Because before I left England, I promised a friend I would find you and tell you what happened to Thomas. But when I had my experience, I made another promise. To myself, or maybe to whatever that light was, that I would speak the truth about what I'd learned. That everyone who loses someone should know they aren't really gone. And you start with us, a Negro family most white folks wouldn't give the time of day. I start with the brother of a man who saved my life and died with more courage than anyone I've ever known." I replied steadily. "Color stops mattering pretty quick when you're both bleeding on the same beach, sir. It matters even less once you've seen beyond this world altogether." Something in James's face eased slightly. He reached for his wife's hand before speaking again. "Tommy wrote about you, you know. Said there was this Nebraska farm boy in his unit who treated him like a man, not a color. Said if more white folks were like that, maybe America could live up to what it claims to be." The words hit me with unexpected force. I hadn't realized Washington had even noticed my efforts to treat him equally, let alone thought them worthy of mention in letters home. We talked for another hour, the conversation shifting from Thomas to the war to their lives in Chicago. James worked at a meatpacking plant, Sarah as a seamstress. They had a son, 7 years old, named James Jr., who was at school. They spoke of the discrimination they faced daily, the limitations placed on their lives despite Thomas's sacrifice for his country. As I prepared to leave, Sarah pressed a small package into my hands. "Tommy's personal effects," she explained. "They sent them to us, but there's something in there I think he'd want you to have." Back at my hotel room, I opened the package. Among the few possessions Thomas had carried to war was a small, worn Bible. A slip of paper marked a page in Ecclesiastes. "One generation passeth away, and another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever." In the margin, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Death is not the end." I sat on the edge of the bed, holding that Bible with its prophetic message, and wept for the first time since my return from the other side. The remainder of my journey home was quiet reflection, punctuated by the rhythmic clacking of train wheels. America rolled past my window, cities giving way to towns, towns to endless fields, the landscape gradually flattening and opening into the familiar Great Plains of my youth. I sent a telegram ahead, informing my family of my arrival date. Part of me worried they wouldn't recognize the man who was returning to them. Physically, I was thinner, my face more angular, with a new scar cutting across my left eyebrow from a minor wound I'd barely noticed in the chaos of D-Day. But the internal changes were far more significant. The train pulled into Hastings Station on a crisp October afternoon. As I stepped onto the platform scanning the small crowd, I spotted them immediately. My father, straight back despite his limp. My mother, her hand clutching her handbag so tightly her knuckles were white. My sisters, Mary and Beth, now young women rather than the girls I'd left behind. For a suspended moment, we just stared at each other across the divide of experience. Then my mother broke, rushing forward with a cry to envelop me in her arms. The rest followed, and we stood there on the platform, a tangle of embraces and tears and broken words. "You're home," my mother kept saying. "You're really home." My father, never one for displays of emotion, gripped my shoulder with surprising strength. "Welcome back, son," his voice rough with feeling. The drive to the farm was a torrent of updates. How the crops had fared, who had married, which neighbors had sons still fighting, or, in too many cases, sons who wouldn't be coming home. I listened, offered responses where expected, but felt eerily detached from these concerns that had once been the whole of my world. The farm itself looked smaller somehow, the white farmhouse and red barn less imposing than in my memory. But the land itself, the endless sky, the rolling fields stretching to the horizon, that remained as vast and eternal as ever. That first evening home was a celebration. Mom had prepared all my favorite foods. Neighbors stopped by to welcome me home, and my sisters proudly showed off my picture and Purple Heart to anyone who would look. I played my part, the returning hero, but felt increasingly like an actor in someone else's play. Late that night, when the visitors had gone and my family had finally gone to bed, I stepped outside onto the porch. The Nebraska night was alive with stars, more than you could ever see in Europe with its constant pall of war smoke. I sat in my father's old rocking chair, breathing in the familiar sense of earth and grass and home, and tried to reconcile the man I had become with the boy who had left this place. "Can't sleep?" My father's voice startled me. He emerged from the shadows, pipe in hand, the ember glowing in the darkness. "Just getting reacquainted," I said. He nodded, settling into the chair beside mine. For a while, we just sat in silence, something we'd always been able to do comfortably together. Finally, he spoke. "Your mother thinks you're the same boy who left." "I know better." I glanced at him, surprised. "How?" "I came back from France in 18. Different war, same change in a man's eyes." He puffed thoughtfully on his pipe. "Want to talk about it?" So I did. Not everything, not yet, but about the beach, the fighting, the wound that had nearly taken my life. He listened without interruption, occasionally nodding in recognition of experiences that echoed his own from a different war. "The doctors say I'll heal completely," I finished, physically at least. "And the rest?" he asked, astute as always. I hesitated, then decided to test the waters. "Dad, do you believe there's something after we die?" He considered the question carefully, tapping his pipe against the porch railing. "Your mother would say yes without hesitation. She's got her faith solid as this house. Me, I've seen too much to be certain of much. But sometimes," he paused, seeming to weigh whether to continue. "Sometimes," I prompted. "After the Argonne," he said slowly, "I got caught in a gas attack. Bad one, mustard gas. Couldn't breathe, felt like my lungs were on fire. They told me later my heart stopped for a bit before they got a mask on me." He fell silent, staring out at the darkened fields. "Did you experience anything?" I asked, heart suddenly racing. His eyes, when they turned to me, held a vulnerability I'd never seen there. "Saw my brother. Just Charlie. He died at Belleau Wood just months before. Saw him plain as I'm seeing you now. He told me it wasn't my time yet, that I needed to go back." A long pause. "Never told anyone that. Not even your mother. Figured they'd think the gas addled my brain." The revelation hit me like a physical force. All these years, my father had carried an experience similar to mine, keeping it secret for fear of disbelief or ridicule. I died too, Dad, I said quietly. On the evacuation boat. My heart stopped. And I saw things. Experienced things that I can't explain in any ordinary way. In halting words, I described my near-death experience, the leaving of my body, the expanded awareness, the light, the presences, the choice to return. As I spoke, I watched his face carefully, ready for skepticism or concern. Instead, I saw recognition and something like relief. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. Then, I always wondered if it was real or if my mind made it up to comfort me. Hearing you describe it, it's too similar to be coincidence. It was real, I said with certainty. What we both experienced, it was real. He nodded slowly. Does your mother know? Not yet. I wasn't sure how to tell anyone. The doctors in England thought I was confused from trauma or medication. Your mother will understand better than you think. Her faith gives her a framework for these things. He tapped his pipe again, emptying the spent tobacco. But the world at large, that's a different matter. I know, I said, but I feel like I'm supposed to share this somehow. That it's why I came back. He studied me in the darkness. Then you will. But give yourself time first. Get your land legs back. The message isn't going anywhere. We sat together a while longer. Two men connected by blood and now by an experience that transcended ordinary understanding. When we finally went inside, something had shifted between us. A new depth of connection that would sustain us through the challenges ahead. The following weeks were a period of readjustment. I helped with the last of the harvest, finding comfort in the physical labor despite the occasional twinge from my healing wound. I reconnected with old friends, some of whom had served in different theaters of the war, others who had remained behind for essential agricultural work. I attended church with my mother, finding new meaning in the familiar rituals. And I began to write, at first just for myself, detailed accounts of my near-death experience, reflections on what it meant, attempts to articulate the profound sense of purpose I now felt. Later, I wrote letters to other veterans I'd met in the convalescent hospital who had shared similar experiences, forming a loose network of men who had touched the other side in return. In late November, I finally worked up the courage to visit Sarah Johnson. She lived with her parents on a neighboring farm and had written faithfully throughout my deployment. Her last letter, received in England, had contained what amounted to a declaration of love and a question about our future. Her father answered the door, greeting me with the formal politeness of a man not yet sure if he wanted me as a son-in-law. Sarah appeared behind him, her face lighting up in a way that made my heart constrict with both joy and uncertainty. "Ray," she said, stepping past her father to embrace me briefly. "You're finally home." She was as beautiful as I remembered. Honey blonde hair, clear blue eyes, a sprinkling of freckles across her nose. But seeing her now, after everything, I felt a strange distance. The boy who had pined for Sarah Johnson seemed to belong to another lifetime. We walked the boundaries of her family's property, catching up on months of separation. She spoke of her work as a teacher at the local school, of community changes, of her hopes now that the war seemed to be turning decisively in the Allies' favor. I shared sanitized versions of my experiences, focusing on England, the camaraderie of my unit, even humorous incidents from training. But as we talked, I could feel the weight of what remained unsaid, my near-death experience and how it had transformed me, her expectations of a future together now that I had returned. Finally, as we stood by the old oak that marked the property line, she turned to me directly. "You're different," she said, no accusation in her voice, just observation. "The war changes everyone who goes through it." I offered the easy explanation. She shook her head. "No, it's more than that. It's like you're here, but part of you is somewhere else entirely." Her perception was unnervingly accurate. I took a deep breath, deciding she deserved the truth. "Something happened to me, Sarah. Something I'm still trying to understand." I told her about my injury, about dying on the evacuation boat, about the experience that followed. I watched her face as I spoke, seeing a range of emotions: concern, confusion, wonder, and finally a subtle withdrawal. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, tracing patterns in the dirt with the toe of her shoe. "Do you think it was real?" she finally asked. "Not just your mind creating comfort while your heart was stopped?" "I know it was real," I said simply. "More real than this conversation, this tree, this moment." She nodded slowly. "That must be overwhelming. It changes how you see everything," I acknowledged. "But in a good way, mostly. Now, knowing that there's more than just this life, that we're all connected in ways we can't normally perceive. It's actually comforting. And you feel you need to share this. Make it your mission? There was something careful in her voice. I do. Somehow. I'm still figuring out exactly how. She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with a soft sadness. That's not the future you wrote about in your letters. The farm children, a simple life here. I know, I said, the truth of it settling between us. I still want those things. But I can't pretend I'm the same person who wrote those letters. And I can't pretend I understand what you've experienced, she replied gently. Or that I can follow you into whatever this new purpose is. We walked back to her house in a silence laden with mutual recognition of a path not to be taken together. At her door, she kissed my cheek. I'm glad you came back, Ray. The world needs people who have seen what you've seen, even if they don't know it yet. It was both an ending and a blessing, and I carried it with me as I walked the 3 miles back to my family's farm under a sky crowded with stars. Christmas came, bringing a dusting of snow and the comfort of family traditions. I received a battered package from Europe. Freckles had survived his injuries and sent a bottle of questionable French cognac with a note, "Save some for when I get back, farm boy." The gesture gave me hope that some connections at least would endure. As 1944 gave way to 1945, news of the war's progress dominated every conversation. The Battle of the Bulge had everyone on edge, with fresh casualties reported daily. I followed the reports with a complex mix of emotions: relief at having escaped, guilt at not being there with my unit, and a strange certainty that the outcome, whatever it might be, was part of a larger pattern I had glimpsed beyond the veil. In February, I received an unexpected letter from James Washington. He wrote that he had been reflecting on our conversation, on what I had shared about my experience, and that it had brought him and Sarah a measure of peace they hadn't thought possible. He asked if I would be willing to speak with a few other families in his community who had lost sons in the war. After discussing it with my parents, I took the train back to Chicago. This time, James met me at the station and brought me to his church, a small Baptist congregation in the heart of the South Side. There in the church basement, I found myself facing about a dozen people, all Negro, all bearing the unmistakable look of grief. James introduced me simply as a soldier who had fought alongside his brother and who had something important to share. Looking at those expectant faces, I suddenly felt inadequate to the task. Who was I to offer comfort, a white lieutenant speaking to people whose loss was compounded by the country's failure to honor their son's sacrifices with equality and respect? But then I remembered the light, the understanding I had been granted, and knew that some truths transcend our human divisions. I died on June 6, 1944, I began. For about 4 minutes, my heart didn't beat. Doctors would say my brain was shutting down, that what I experienced was a hallucination caused by lack of oxygen. But I know differently. I told my story without embellishment or apology. I described the expanded awareness, the encounters with those who had passed on, the profound love and acceptance I had felt in the presence of the light. I spoke of understanding that we are all connected, that the barriers we create between us in this world, race, nationality, religion, have no meaning in the greater reality. When I finished, there was silence. Then an elderly woman in the front row spoke up. My grandson, he died at Salerno. Italian campaign. In the last letter he wrote, he told me he had a dream where his father, my son who passed in 36, came to him and told him not to be afraid. I've been holding on to that, wondering if it meant something. It did, I said with certainty. Those connections are real. The veil between this world and the next gets thin sometimes, especially when people are close to crossing over themselves. Others began to share then. Stories of unusual dreams, of inexplicable moments of peace that came in the midst of grief, of deathbed visions reported by hospital nurses. Each story reinforced what I had experienced, weaving a tapestry of evidence for a reality beyond our physical understanding. That evening led to others. Word spread, and I found myself invited to speak to more groups. First in Negro churches, where my uniform and white face caused initial surprise, then eventually to mixed audiences in community halls and private homes. Sometimes only a handful of people would attend, other times dozens. I never took money for these talks, despite occasionally being offered it. This wasn't about financial gain, but about fulfilling the purpose I had been shown during my near-death experience, to share the truth that death is not the end, that love continues, that we are all part of something greater than our earthly identities. News of my talks began to spread beyond Chicago. A small newspaper in Milwaukee ran a story. Day veteran claims to have died and returned with message of hope. A radio station in Des Moines invited me for an interview. I received letters from strangers, some skeptical, some desperate for reassurance about departed loved ones, some sharing their own brushes with death. Not everyone was receptive, of course. The established churches had mixed reactions. Some ministers embraced my experiences as confirmation of religious teachings about the afterlife. Others viewed my claims with suspicion, concerned that I was promoting unorthodox spirituality. My own pastor back in Nebraska expressed concern that I was drifting from traditional doctrine, though he never directly suggested I stop sharing my story. The medical community was largely dismissive. A neurologist in Chicago published a paper speculating that near-death experiences like mine were merely the result of a dying brain's attempt to comfort itself. No more real than dreams. When a local newspaper asked me to respond, I simply said, I understand their skepticism. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I might share it. But I know what I experienced wasn't a dream or hallucination. It was more real than this interview. Through it all, my family remained supportive, if sometimes bewildered by the direction my life had taken. My father, with his own secret experience, understood best. My mother found ways to reconcile my story with her Christian faith, seeing no contradiction between my experience of the light and her belief in God's love. My sisters were my most enthusiastic advocates, proudly telling friends about their brother who had seen the other side. In May 1945, as spring painted the Nebraska landscape in fresh green, news came of Germany's surrender. The celebration was tempered by the knowledge that fighting continued in the Pacific. But for those of us with connections to the European theater, it marked a significant milestone. A week later, a battered truck pulled up to our farmhouse. A lanky figure unfolded from the driver's seat, red hair catching the afternoon sun. "Told you I'd find you, farm boy," Freckles called, his face now heavily scarred on one side, split in a familiar grin. Our reunion was joyous, backslaps and handshakes giving way to a genuine embrace. He had received his own medical discharge and had decided to drive cross-country from Massachusetts to California, with a detour to Nebraska to see me. That evening, after dinner with my family, we sat on the porch with glasses of his now depleted cognac, catching up on the months since we'd last seen each other in that English hospital. "So I hear you've become something of a preacher," he said with a smirk, "spreading the gospel of the afterlife to the masses." "Hardly the masses," I chuckled. "Just people who've lost someone and need to know it's not the end." He nodded, his expression growing more serious. "You know, I didn't experience anything like you did when I was injured. But after what you told me in England, I've been watching, listening. The number of guys I've met who had similar experiences. It's not just you, Ray." "I know," I said. "I've been corresponding with some of them. There's a captain in Philadelphia, a corporal in Atlanta, a Navy man in San Diego, all with stories so similar to mine it can't be coincidence." "And now what? You just keep traveling around, telling your story?" I shrugged. "For now, until I figure out if there's something more I'm supposed to do with it." Freckles studied me, the cognac gleaming amber in his glass. "You know, before the war, I was studying journalism at Boston College. Had dreams of being a reporter. Now," he gestured at his scarred face, "not exactly the mug for television, but print. Print doesn't care what you look like." "You thinking of going back to school?" I asked. "Eventually. But first I'm thinking someone should be documenting these experiences. Not just yours, but all of them. All the men coming back with stories of what they saw when they nearly died, or actually died and came back." His eyes held a familiar spark of mischief and determination. "Could be a book, could be a series of articles, but it needs to be written, and it needs to be written well." I stared at him, seeing the pieces fall into place. "You want to write about near-death experiences? I want us to write about them," he corrected. "Your experiences, your connections with others who've been through it, my journalism training. Could be something important, Ray." The idea resonated with a certainty I had come to recognize as guidance. It would reach more people than my talks ever could. "Exactly," he said, raising his glass. "To new missions, Lieutenant." We clinked glasses, sealing a partnership that would shape the coming years. Freckles stayed for a week, during which we sketched out plans for what would eventually become our life's work. He would continue his journey to California, but begin collecting accounts along the way. I would formalize and expand my network of near-death experiencers, focusing particularly on veterans. We would correspond regularly, sharing findings and refining our approach. After he left, I threw myself into the work with renewed purpose. I placed small advertisements in veterans' publications. Did you experience something unusual during a close brush with death? Lieutenant Raymond Collins wants to hear your story. I wrote to hospitals and rehabilitation centers across the country, seeking connections with wounded servicemen who might have had similar experiences. The responses exceeded our expectations. Dozens, then hundreds of letters arrived, from men who had nearly drowned in the Pacific, who had been trapped in burning tanks, who had been declared dead on operating tables only to revive with stories of tunnels and light and deceased comrades. Not all were veterans. I heard from civilians too. A woman who had nearly died in childbirth, a man who had survived a catastrophic mining accident, a child who had been clinically dead for 6 minutes after falling through ice, reminding me powerfully of my father's story about his own father. The patterns were consistent enough to be striking, yet each experience carried personal elements that spoke to its authenticity. In August, the war finally ended, with Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The news brought complex emotions: relief that the killing had stopped, discomfort at the means that had brought about that end, and a strange detached sadness for all souls, American and Japanese alike, who had crossed the veil in those final cataclysmic moments. By fall, Freckles had returned from California, and we established a more formal base for our work in a small office in Lincoln, Nebraska, close enough to my family's farm to maintain those connections, but urban enough to facilitate travel and communication. Using his GI Bill benefits, Freckles enrolled in the University of Nebraska to complete his journalism degree, while I managed our growing network of correspondents. Our first article, Beyond the Battlefield, Soldiers Report Journeys to the Afterlife, was published in a small veterans journal in December 1945. It presented 5 anonymous accounts, including my own, of near-death experiences during combat situations, with an analysis of the common elements. The response was immediate and polarizing. Letters of gratitude from those who had similar experiences and had felt isolated, alongside dismissive critiques from medical professionals and traditional religious leaders. Undeterred, we continued our work, expanding our focus beyond combat experiences to include civilian accounts. Freckles proved to be an excellent interviewer, able to put people at ease when discussing the most profound moments of their lives. I found I had a talent for identifying patterns and making connections between diverse experiences, seeing the universal truths that underlay the individual details. In early 1946, we were contacted by a psychology professor from Harvard who had been quietly collecting similar accounts for years. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan had begun her research after her brother, a pilot, had described a profound experience during a near-fatal crash in 1943. Rather than dismissing such accounts as hallucinations, she had documented them with scientific rigor, looking for empirical patterns. "Your work adds an important dimension to mine," she wrote. "I've focused on the psychological aspects, but you're addressing the spiritual implications that I've been hesitant to explore in an academic context." Our collaboration with Dr. Morgan brought academic credibility to our work. Together, we developed a more structured approach to collecting and analyzing near-death accounts. She taught us interview techniques to minimize leading questions, ways to verify details where possible, and methods for categorizing experiences without imposing our own interpretations. That summer, as our research continued to grow, I received an unexpected letter from Washington, D.C. A senator's wife had read one of our articles and been deeply moved, as she had experienced something similar during a complicated surgery years earlier. She had shared it with her husband, Senator Thomas Wilson of Michigan, who had a professional interest in veterans affairs and a personal interest in spiritual matters. The letter invited us to speak at a private gathering in the senator's home, with an audience of about 24 people, a mix of politicians, military officials, and religious leaders. It represented our first real opportunity to bring these experiences to the attention of those with national influence. Freckles and I traveled to Washington in July, nervous but determined. The senator's home was an elegant Georgetown townhouse, a far cry from the church basements and community halls where I had previously shared my story. The gathering included 2 generals, a Supreme Court justice, the head of a major veterans organization, and clergy from several denominations. I spoke first, sharing my own near-death experience with the simple directness I had found most effective. Then Freckles presented some of the patterns we had identified across hundreds of accounts: the sensation of leaving one's body, the encounter with deceased loved ones, the life review, the choice to return. Dr. Morgan had provided statistical analyses that we incorporated, showing how consistent these elements were, regardless of the experiencer's religious background, education level, or circumstances of their brush with death. The discussion that followed was thoughtful and surprisingly open-minded. General Kavanaugh, a decorated World War I veteran, shared that one of his most trusted colonels had described a similar experience after being severely wounded at the Battle of the Bulge. Reverend Michaels, a Methodist minister, reflected that while such experiences didn't contradict Christian teachings about the afterlife, they did challenge some denominational specifics. Senator Wilson himself proved to be our most enthusiastic supporter. "Gentlemen," he said as the evening concluded, "I believe you've encountered something of profound importance, not just for veterans seeking meaning in their sacrifices, but for all humanity. How can I help advance this work?" With the senator's support, several doors opened. He facilitated a small research grant through the Veterans Administration to formally study near-death experiences among returning servicemen. He arranged for us to speak at several prestigious venues, including the National Press Club. Perhaps most significantly, he introduced us to a publisher interested in a book-length treatment of our findings. By early 1947, Freckles and I were dividing our time between ongoing research and writing what would become Glimpses Beyond, the near-death experiences of American soldiers. We approached the book as journalists rather than religious interpreters, presenting the accounts as faithfully as possible while identifying the patterns that emerged without insisting on any particular theological framework. The writing process forced us to confront questions we had previously set aside. What exactly was the light that so many experienced? Was it the Christian God or something broader? Why did some people have these experiences while others, clinically dead for similar periods, reported nothing? Were there cultural influences shaping how people interpreted what they experienced? We didn't claim to have definitive answers. Instead, we presented the evidence and acknowledged the mystery, inviting readers to consider the implications for themselves. This approach proved wise when the book was published in September 1947. Reviews were predictably mixed. Scientific journals dismissed it as anecdotal and unrigorous. Religious publications ranged from enthusiastic embrace to warnings about unorthodox spirituality. But mainstream coverage was surprisingly positive, with several major newspapers running thoughtful features on the phenomenon. Most importantly, the book reached people who needed it: families struggling with grief, veterans grappling with survivors' guilt, individuals who had had similar experiences but never spoken of them for fear of ridicule. Letters poured in, thousands of them, with many beginning, "I've never told anyone this before, but..." The book's publication changed my life in unexpected ways. I began receiving invitations to speak at universities, medical conferences, religious gatherings, and veterans events across the country. Freckles, never comfortable with public speaking due to his facial scars, focused on the research and writing side of our partnership, working on a follow-up volume focused on civilian experiences. As our work gained attention, so did criticism from various quarters. A prominent neurologist published a paper proposing that near-death experiences were nothing more than the brain's final hallucinations as it was deprived of oxygen. A conservative religious coalition issued a statement warning that our work promoted New Age spiritualism, incompatible with biblical teaching. A psychology journal ran an article suggesting that combat veterans' accounts were particularly suspect due to PTSD and survivor's guilt. We addressed these criticisms as best we could, acknowledging the limits of our evidence while standing by the authenticity of the experiences we had documented. We don't claim scientific proof of an afterlife. I often said in response to skeptical questioning, we simply present these consistent accounts and ask what they might mean. Through it all, my own conviction never wavered. I knew what I had experienced was real, more real than anything in ordinary consciousness. And the thousands of similar accounts we had collected only reinforced that certainty. One crisp autumn day in 1948, as I was sorting through mail in our Lincoln office, I came across an envelope with familiar handwriting. Inside was a brief note from Sarah Johnson, now Sarah Anderson, I learned, and a newspaper clipping about our book. "I still don't fully understand what you experienced," she wrote, "but I'm proud of what you've done with it. You were right to follow this path." Her words brought unexpected closure to a chapter of my life I had never properly finished. I wrote back, congratulating her on her marriage and thanking her for her support. We had both found our right paths, just not together. That same year brought another milestone when I met Catherine Hayes, a young widow whose husband had died at Iwo Jima. She had come to one of my talks in Omaha, not seeking comfort. She had made her peace with her loss, but out of intellectual curiosity about the afterlife. Her questions were thoughtful, challenging me to clarify my thinking and articulate aspects of the experience I had previously struggled to express. Our professional correspondence became friendship and gradually something more. Unlike Sarah, Catherine had no expectation that I would be the man I was before the war. She was interested in who I had become, in the work that drove me, in the experience that had shaped my understanding of life and death. We married in spring of 1949, establishing a home in Lincoln that served as both family residence and base for our expanding work. Catherine brought not only love, but intellectual partnership. Her background in library science proving invaluable in organizing the massive collection of accounts and research we had accumulated. The 1950s saw our work evolve in new directions. The Cold War and its nuclear anxieties had created a cultural preoccupation with mortality. Our initial focus on combat-related near-death experiences broadened to include medical cases, accident survivors, and eventually accounts from different cultures around the world. Freckles, now James O'Malley in his professional life, had become a respected journalist beyond our shared work, writing for major publications on veterans issues. He married a nurse he had met during one of his hospital interviews, and they settled in Boston, where he combined teaching journalism at his alma mater with continued research into near-death phenomena. I found myself increasingly drawn to the intersection of these experiences with various religious traditions. I studied comparative religion, noting how near-death accounts often transcended specific dogmas while containing elements recognizable within many faith traditions. This led to dialogue with religious scholars from diverse backgrounds, Christian theologians, Jewish rabbis, Buddhist monks, Hindu swamis, and indigenous spiritual leaders. A particularly meaningful connection formed with Rabbi David Levinson, who had served as a chaplain during the Normandy invasion. What strikes me about these experiences, he told me during a conference in New York, is how they point to something universal beneath all our different ways of describing the divine. The light you encountered, in my tradition, we might call it the Shekinah, the divine presence. But the experience itself transcends our naming of it. Through these dialogues, I came to see our work as building bridges between science and spirituality, between different religious traditions, between the bereaved and those they had lost. This was, I believed, the purpose I had glimpsed during my own journey beyond the veil. Catherine and I were blessed with 2 children, Thomas, born in 1950 and named in honor of Thomas Washington, and Elizabeth, who arrived in 1952. Parenthood brought new dimensions to my understanding of love and connection, deepening my appreciation for the message I had been entrusted to share. I made sure my children knew their father's unusual story from an early age, presenting it not as something strange or frightening, but as a natural part of our family's experience. Everyone returns to the light eventually. I explained when they first asked about death. I just got a peek behind the curtain a little early. They grew up surrounded by discussions of near-death experiences, meeting the endless stream of researchers, experiencers, and spiritual seekers who pass through our home. Far from finding this unsettling, they developed an unusual comfort with the topic of mortality and a natural curiosity about spiritual matters. By the 1960s, cultural attitudes were shifting. The rigid consensus of the post-war years was fracturing, opening space for exploration of consciousness, spirituality, and non-ordinary experiences. Our work, once considered fringe, found new receptivity in this changing landscape. Academic interest was growing too. In 1965, I was invited to participate in a pioneering research program at the University of Virginia, where doctors were systematically documenting and analyzing near-death experiences reported by cardiac patients. For the first time, medical science was taking these accounts seriously enough to study them under controlled conditions. This research eventually led to one of the most compelling aspects of our work: documented cases of accurate perception during clinical death. Patients who had flatlined on operating tables later described, in accurate detail, resuscitation procedures, conversations among medical staff, and even objects or events in other rooms that they could not possibly have witnessed through ordinary means. These cases challenged conventional explanations of near-death experiences as mere hallucinations. Throughout these decades, I never lost sight of where it all began. On that blood-soaked beach in Normandy, and on the evacuation boat where my heart had stopped. Each June 6th, I observed a private ritual of remembrance, Not only for my fallen comrades, but for the profound gift of that glimpse beyond the veil that had shaped my life's purpose. In 1969, 25 years after D-Day, I returned to Normandy for the anniversary commemorations. Walking Omaha Beach on a peaceful summer morning, watching children play where so many had died, I was struck by how ordinary it looked. Just sand and water and sky. No visible trace of the momentous struggle that had unfolded there. Yet for me it remained sacred ground. The place where I had come closest to eternity, where my old self had died and a new purpose had been born. I stood at the water's edge, letting the gentle waves wash over my shoes, and whispered names I had never forgotten. Washington, Miller, Rossi, the nameless kid who had helped me through the wire. I kept my promise. I told them. I came back and shared what I learned. I spoke the truth. The wind carried my words away, but I felt a sense of completion, of a circle closing. And in that moment, just briefly, I experienced again the expanded awareness I had known in death. The sense of connection to all things, the recognition that love transcends time and space and physical separation. It lasted only seconds, but it was enough to remind me of what awaits us all beyond the thin veil of ordinary perception. Enough to renew my commitment to the message I had been given, that death is not the end, that love continues, that we are all, ultimately, on a journey home to the light. I left the beach that day with wet shoes and a peaceful heart, knowing that whenever my time truly came to cross over permanently, I would be greeted by familiar presences. Washington would be there, and Freckles eventually, and Catherine someday, and my children far in the future. All the souls I had loved and all those yet to love. But there was still work to do here, still messages to deliver, still truth to speak in a world hungry for meaning. So I returned home to continue the task I had been given on that day in 1944, when I died on an evacuation boat and came back with a message of hope that death is merely a doorway, and beyond it lies not darkness, but light.